All right, Quintin, Ivan, welcome to the Nervous System Training Podcast. Thanks everyone who's watching. We've got a guest on today, Ivan, and I know I've seen your Instagram a little bit. Quintin's giving the rundown. I know you've got an interesting perspective on nervous system training and on especially the historical context, going back to the Soviet principles and all that. So looking forward to get into it. Thank you guys for coming on.
Yeah, me too.
All right. So Ivan, why don't you tell like the viewers like a little bit about yourself, like what you do and some of the ideas you've been thinking about with like training methodology in your area, in your part of the world.
Sure. So my name is Ivan Zagorski, and I'm a strength and conditioning coach. I work with combat athletes as well as team sport athletes and game sport athletes in general. I was born and raised in Russia, and then I went to the United States with my family. I lived in the United States for 7 years, so I just got through 1 year of middle school, 4 years of high school, and 2 years of college while I was there. And kind of got to experience the American culture, especially the American sports culture. And then I worked for a little while as a sports journalist on a Russian TV channel. And all that time, I was very interested in just sports. I played a lot of basketball myself, and I would watch those American videos on the new website, as it was back in the day, called YouTube, and just reading all those articles. Like, you know how the American media is. It's like it's 3:55 a.m. and this guy already got 7 buckets of sweat dripping off of him in a small town. And this is how he's the biggest beast in the NFL right now, or in the NBA, or whatever. So I was enamored by those stories, and I started looking at how athletes trained, and it always interested me more than just doing like general training, like fitness, getting a big bicep pump, or just doing like bodybuilder style leg day. And so that curiosity eventually led me to start taking some courses on Pilates, on strength and conditioning, fitness, and things like that. And I became a strength and conditioning coach, starting with the general population and working my way up to eventually working with some pro athletes. So that's kind of the quick rundown there. And some of the ideas there, I guess, like to expand on that, I would then see that everybody is kind of doing very similar things. So there's a lot of emphasis on, strength training to build the base, and then you do some speed strength work, and you throw in plyometrics and sprints, maybe some mobility and things like that. But as I talked to some people, I saw that there are very different ways to approach training. Like my friend is a practitioner in traditional Chinese martial arts, so he has a very different perspective. I started seeing a variety of different videos online, like with the Marinovich system and many other systems that emphasize very different things. So that kind of led me down to the road which I'm going down as of today.
Okay, interesting.
And so can you just kind of paint me a picture of your gym, the types of equipment you use in your gym, the philosophies, and like what does a training day look like with most of your clients, especially the athletes?
For the most part, I have most of my clients online nowadays because I do travel a lot. But back when I worked at the gym, I did a lot of kind of this conventional training because that's what I learned. I think we'll get into it a little bit more about like the Soviet heritage and stuff, but I kind of grew up learning from the American strength and conditioning system, and then went back and read some of the Soviet literature to see where that foundation came from and where a lot of the ideas came from. So I used to do a lot of kind of traditional lifting with the athletes. I would start off like maybe with some sprints and some plyometrics, would go to some like loaded jumps or Olympic lifts so they were proficient at it, or I could coach them quickly on that, and then I would go to just this classic strength training. And what I saw was that, some athletes were getting some good results from that, others not necessarily so. I couldn't say that a lot of injuries were necessarily prevented either. So, like a guy would get injured and it's just in a game, like somebody ran into my knee. Okay, well, there's nothing you can do about it. But could he have been more efficient neurologically, to avoid that situation in the first place? That's kind of the open question there. And so later it evolved into kind of more work with kind of softer qualities. I have a background in Pilates, so I added a lot of kind of Pilates elements, things that are working on balance, things that have to do with building from the foot up, and all of these concepts. And I found that it's very challenging for a lot of athletes to do that. Like there's a guy like 40-inch vertical, huge, 6'4", 6'5", can obviously jump out the gym, run very fast, but he can barely balance on one leg, and he's very, very stiff. Like he can't do like a simple Pilates leg circle very well, and he's all shaking. So I just started to think, where can I fill in the blanks here and really take their performance to the next level? So nowadays I'm focusing more on that, whether it's online or whether if I, travel to wherever an athlete is and work with them personally.
Okay. So you have a very unique perspective. A lot like, this is kind of cool because it's a lot like we had a ex-professional Japanese baseball player, Kent, and he grew up kind of in the West, but also played sports like in the East. And you're kind of like in a similar situation where you've seen both worlds, how like the Russians been doing it and how like the Americans do it. Now let's kind of start from the beginning, because a lot of the training methodology that is starting to reemerge, and that's influencing a lot is like old Soviet like sports science that was developed during the Cold War. Let's kind of start from the beginning. Tell me a little bit about when you were like a lot younger, growing up in Russia, so like the 80s and 90s. Like, what exactly was going on with sports, and how do you think that kind of influenced this switching of, because right now you've been telling me that currently in Russia, they're doing things more the Western style right now. But they weren't always doing that. Majority of their history, they were doing it a lot differently, more towards like the Dr. Yuri Verkhovensky style. When did they lose sight of that? What was going on in like the 80s and 90s where they kind of lost their way with the Soviet sports science and started to like fall into the weightlifting Western system?
So I think you have to take it back a little bit more than that. And I think in general, it's pretty difficult for the Western mind and maybe for the more contemporary Russian mind to picture a society that wasn't, a transactional and all based on money. But that's what the Soviet Union obviously was, with all the pros and cons of it. And so what used to be the case was, can't beat the Americans in a war necessarily without destroying each other, but you could beat them at the Olympics every 4 years or the World Championships every couple of years or whatever the case may be. And those wins in sports were very important ideologically to show that, all right, the Soviet ideology is superior on the world stage, and it would also rally the people back home. So the entire system around sport was very efficient and very well funded. So, for example, in any area of the Soviet Union, you could find a sports school, and they would provide all the equipment. They would provide you with free lessons in your sport, and you could attend at any time that you wanted. And so then they would see if some kids have certain talents, and they would kind of let the parents know that, all right, your kid's doing way better than average in this sport. So maybe you want to pursue putting him into a boarding school where he's just going to live and train, and that's all going to be paid for by the government. It wasn't like any kind of a pressure towards that, to where like if you don't do it, they arrest your whole family. But it was certainly a lucrative choice for the people, regardless, because being an athlete was quite prestigious. They got to travel overseas, which was not something that everybody could do easily. And they could eventually, get a job as a coach, or even rub shoulders with a Communist Party elite and really have a kind of a political career as well. And so everything was structured to where in every corner of the Soviet Union, they were able to get all of the potentially talented kids and see what they're capable of. And from the sports science side, then you had these national research institutes, which is kind of a unique organizational setup. I think it's unique to just the Soviet Union, where, again, it was just fully government funded, and people were getting a salary to basically just nerd out over like plyometrics and the stretch shortening cycle or whatever they were studying. So that was also a really good deal to the scientists. They could do what they love doing, and they could get paid for it. There wasn't necessarily like a large pay scale in the Soviet Union, but they would get maybe a government apartment that's a little bit better than an average factory worker. They'd get paid a little bit more. They would have a few more perks, and potentially they would obviously have status in the society as well. And so as they were working their way up in those research institutes, or even in public universities at a certain faculty, they had a chance to get their feet under them without much pressure to perform until obviously they worked to a higher level. And so then when the Soviet Union collapsed, all of that funding basically disappeared. And that whole uniform system started to collapse because it was a lot of shock reforms when basically like all those pieces broke off from the Soviet Union and Russia had to transition to a market economy in a very kind of a shock scenario where a lot of people who were in the right place at the right time and understood what the upcoming reality is going to be. They got very, very rich. A lot of people got very poor and lost it all. And the sports scientists basically left Russia to go overseas because they already made a name for themselves and they could get paid doing the same thing there. And they didn't have any funding back in Russia. So Verkhoshansky, I believe, went to Italy. Vladimir Zatsiorsky, I think, still lectures at Penn State as a professor of kinesiology. He's got to be like in his 90s right now. Bondarchuk, I believe, went to Canada. And so these top minds left. So you had what's called a brain drain. And there was really a lot of chaos. You know, that time period was called the wild 90s in the Russia. A lot of organized crime gangs were running things. The police could barely do anything against them. The reforms were really taking a toll on the middle class, and there was a lot of poverty. And so maybe some funding remained for sports like hockey and some of the other kind of national pride sports, maybe things like figure skating and gymnastics and things like that. But it was severely reduced. And so that system kind of started to fall apart because the sports technique could be more easily maintained because, like, you know, any decent level former athlete can teach kids technique. And so they had kind of maintained the skill aspect of some of the sports. But the sports science obviously requires constant research, constant funding. It requires constantly working with the athletes to monitor how they respond and things like that. And so they missed that very vital part. And they no longer had that. And then later on, as the country started to get rebuilt a little bit, kind of at the end of the 90s and towards the early 2000s and on to now, the market economy process started to emerge. And then, you know, there were a lot of trends towards fitness. And then there are a lot of trends towards, you know, strength and conditioning. And everybody's starting to copy the Western model. And they're kind of a few years behind, but they're just copying what they see. And they're now trying to market that. So that's pretty much what happened there.
No, okay, so that's really fascinating. Jake, do you have anything to add to that or a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could kind of give a picture of what training is like right now in not just Russia, but that part of the world as much as you would know. We've talked about it a lot. A lot of the best fighters in the world are from that part of the world. We had an interesting conversation last week with Kent about kind of how the samurai culture has influenced the way baseball training is done. And so I'm curious, like you've mentioned the contemporary Russian mindset is kind of being more similar to the Western training mindset, but I'm curious, like the results are still there. What parts of the historical approach do you think are still integrated into the way people live, the way people train, and why do you think there's still so many champions from that part of the world?
Well, I think, first of all, some people just were able to preserve some of the things that they learned and maybe expand upon them themselves if they have a good pool of fighters to experiment on and things like that. Some people still do things just by the book because maybe they received education at a Soviet like physical culture university and they're able to just reuse some of these old methods there. And when it comes to fighters, I think more of that kind of classic school of Soviet boxing and wrestling is still preserved there. I actually talked to a guy. He's a UFC striking coach. He works with a number of UFC athletes. He's from Ukraine, and he said that when he came to America first, people were astounded by a very basic striking session that he had people go through at like a very elite MMA club, And he was just saying we were just doing some of the very basic Soviet stuff, like we would do some footwork drills, very, very basic. Footwork, positioning, striking, just very, very basic, and then a few of the more advanced elements, and then what he liked to call like an additional pump. I don't know what they like how to translate it exactly, but it's kind of like a little bit of a strength and conditioning element there. And so he said everybody was astounded by it, and he was in turn astounded by how incompetent some of the Western trainers are. So I think that's just one of the areas. That's just one of the areas where they were able to preserve that. And in some sports, like combat sports, it's good. But I think in team sports, it might not be as good because they're more focused on just like a lot of kind of like high rep work with low weights, and they're just doing a lot of like endurance stuff. So I think they're leaving a lot of things on the table. But I think when it comes to the combat sports, they were able to preserve that very well and maybe even develop it a little bit. So like some of the structure is still there. There's still those Russian physical culture universities. They still teach some of the Soviet literature. So people can still get those old basics, and maybe they can do something with that as well.
Okay, so technically, the Soviet Union was big into the sports science, government-funded institutes. Basically, they had really set channels for athletes to go down to try to become great. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of those channels and avenues kind of fell apart. Governments lost funding, and a lot of researchers and a lot of innovators, they basically just left Dodge to try to make money elsewhere. Like the Detroit Red Wings. Like our hockey team just freaking went insane in the 90s because we inherited like 5 Soviet hockey players, 5 Olympians. Now, that's kind of interesting. I do want to touch on that point, but I do also want to mention it's kind of funny how when all the science kind of left, and it basically just came down to the coaches, and then Russia started to become a little bit more capitalist. It started to like rebuild, and it kind of like went back into like the American way of doing things. Interest propagates money. Money is kind of where innovation happens, and now they kind of fell into the same loop that the Western strength and conditioning has fallen into, where now they're kind of just doing the heavy weightlifting because this is what's popular. This is, fitness is what's making money. So this is where the research is going. It's kind of interesting where you can clearly see money drives what's going to happen with innovation. Like the Soviet Union, all the money was in the sports science. Plyometrics was developed, periodization process was developed, and that was the standard. Then when the money left, now fitness kind of took over, and that kind of created the new scaffolding for sports performance just because that's where the money is going. Not necessarily because that's what's proven best, but how it's really all ran on money. Like when it comes to like the sports industry, it's really interesting to see that. Now, Ivan. So basically, what you're saying, when all these Soviet scientists kind of branched off to all these different parts of the world, do you think that's one of the main reasons why this sports industry just went out of control in the 90s and early 2000s? Like performances started going through the roof, athletes started making huge salaries, marketing went up. Do you think it's because, and do you think that's the reason why sports developed so much better in the 90s? Because now all these scientists are able to share their ideas with all these different countries.
Yeah, I think there's some of that as well. Yeah, because back in the day, I was actually talking to a Soviet era coach on a Russian podcast that I did with him, and he was saying that a lot of Americans and a lot of Europeans would come to the Soviet Union to learn the methods, and he knew Yuri Verkhoshansky personally, and he said that Verkhoshansky had them like write out certain things that they would share, and then some of the things that they won't share, or maybe they would be more ambiguous about because they had those manuals that were labeled like for internal use only. So a lot of the things was kind of kept a secret. And some coaches were like, I read a book. It was called The System. I think one of the authors is like Al Parker and Johnny Parker or something. So these are like the strength coaches for like the New York Giants when they were winning their Super Bowls, and the NFL teams of the 80s and 90s. And they were also saying that like when they went, the coaches shared some things with them in the Soviet Union, but not others. And so they kind of had to fill in the blanks, and they had to experiment by themselves. So I think, yeah, when that brain drain happened, I think the United States and the Western Europe kind of benefited from that. But I also think that a lot of times in America, they would take certain specific concepts and kind of isolate them and make like a separate system out of it, because I would see some of the things that like I would talk to these Soviet coaches about built into a whole system. So like there'll be like certain exercises, for example, that the coach say, yeah, like we did that, but it was a part of a highly individualized program. Whereas in America, they would make it into a system and just market it, as like this is it, like the secrets of the Iron Curtain have been lifted. Here you go, this will make you an athletic beast and things like that. So yeah, absolutely. I think the rest of the world definitely benefited from that.
Okay, so that's the difference between like the American approach and say the Soviet approach. But they'll take a certain set of modalities that they think will help a very specific athlete and a very specific individual and create a system around that where it's very customized. But the Americans, they will always make it very generalized, and the scientists wouldn't always communicate with the Americans like, no, this is a protocol very specifically for this type of javelin thrower. Maybe not every single javelin thrower, but the Americans will say, okay, this system will work on everyone. So that's kind of the difference between Western generalization of programming and Soviet customization of programming. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah. So, for example, like some of the exercises, like I will be showing this coach some of the isometrics, and I say like, yeah, this is like there's these certain coaches that use this as a big part of their system. You say, well, we did these, but we would do it, for example, for a hammer thrower who had a certain femur length, or he would have a certain like forearm length, and you would have certain mechanics. And we would need to shore up very specific muscles at a very specific period. And this guy, if we had him squat heavy, he would squat in a very specific manner based on his anthropometrics and things like that. Maybe other athletes who were just as successful, if not more, we wouldn't have them squat at all. So yeah, it was very, very highly individualized, and they had it all broken down, what they do pre-competition, what they do post-competition. And there wasn't like a set amount of exercises and type of exercise that they would always do.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Okay.
And then kind of on that note of with the customization and individualization, can you walk me through your assessment protocols with new clients? You're mentioning things like femur length. That's something that I've found over the years. I have long femurs, and it's something but no one ever told me that. It was something. It's not a common variable, but you threw it in there. So what types of movements, what types of like biomechanics are you studying? How does your assessment protocol work?
Well, I think it depends on the age of the athlete primarily. So if the athlete already has some experience, that's a little bit different from like kids, for example. But I like to look at their foot positioning, for example. Some may have more like splayed out feet. Some have more straight feet. I like to just look at how they move in general, like how they approach very basic movements like squatting, hinging, maybe doing some kind of a pushing movement or a pulling movement, whether they have any kind of compensations developed in those movements. If it's with kids, I like to see how they handle tasks such as getting up from the floor without using their hands, for example, and maybe have them do it like 40 to 50 times just to see how their strategy might change. And I also try to look for the athletes' superpowers. So some guys might be very muscular by nature, and they would be using more muscle. Others would be more like kind of wiry guys, like think like a typical high jumper or a really tall basketball player, like extremely long legs, shorter torso. They're like more elastic, so they could maybe jump for a very long time, repeatedly, that they could do like bounds for just like miles and miles on end, whereas a more power-based athlete would get pretty gassed from that volume. But these guys maybe would have some issues like with hip hinging and some other mechanics. So I think it's a combination of factors at the end of the day. But I like to look at how they perform certain basic movements and whether or not they have any kind of compensations with that. And I also like to look at their spine mechanics. So since I'm a Pilates instructor, I like to throw in elements of Pilates in there just to see how they articulate their spine, whether they can move each segment separately, how they side bend, how they rotate, how they extend, and things like that. And then based on that, I would kind of see what they need in their program more. Like, they need more strength, do they need more balance? And I would try to kind of mitigate some of the weaknesses, but try to build up that superpower even more, whatever it is.
That's interesting. Tell me if you've seen this before, Ivan. Where usually when I'm working with an athlete that's really high level, they're like a soccer player. Maybe they're, even if they're still kids, like maybe they're still in high school, but they're just really, really, really high level. Maybe they play for like a very specific travel team, or they're college, or they're professional. Now, have you noticed that there's usually one quality about them that's usually off the charts, whether it's mobility or their strength, or something about them that's off the charts, and everything else, even it might score kind of average, but this one thing is what makes them like just kind of like a freak at what they do.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember working with a downhill skier. He was a member of the Olympic team of one of the post-Soviet republics. And so I'm thinking, like, let's see how his spine mechanics are. And he's bending and twisting every which way. Like, I couldn't even do it. He's like better than some of the advanced yogis, for example. But he wasn't very strong, for example. And maybe some of the like explosiveness could use some work. But that flexibility, I think, really allowed him to stay healthier than some of his teammates, for example. Yeah, I can definitely see that. And other guys would just be exceptionally strong, explosive, like very powerful, just built like a mountain, but very, very stiff. I would see that with Greco-Roman wrestlers a lot, and some basketball players, especially ones from Africa that I got to work with. And they would have like horrible ankle mobility, but they would just be jumping out the gym. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's always like this one quality that kind of maybe masks all the other deficiencies for at least for a while.
Yeah, that's what I kind of noticed, and I remember seeing that because whenever I would get a high level athlete, like a known high level athlete, like they're from Central, or they're like ranked number 3 in softball in the state of Michigan, and I'd run an athletic assessment on them, and I'd always think in the back of my head, I'm like, okay, I'm going to find at least 1 or 2 qualities that's just totally off the charts, and all the other qualities, like their mobility, their strength, their flexibility, their biomechanics, are usually kind of built to support this one quality that's just uncontrollable. And that's really the difference between like your average athlete and your freak athlete. And there's this one other guy, he's a NFL player. I didn't work with him for a long time, but I did his athletic assessment. Everything was kind of average. Hamstring strength was kind of average. Core strength was kind of average. But his tightness, his ability to get tight and to brace was just insane. Like, it made no sense. But everything else was kind of average. So all these other physical qualities about him were kind of designed to support this one superpower that gave him the abilities to perform at an extraordinary level. So it's really interesting to kind of hear you kind of are seeing the same sort of pattern.
Yeah, for sure. And then like I think a lot of times coaches might try to like correct certain things, which might like start to take away from that a little bit. And like I would see that a lot, like in the kind of Pilates and the corrective exercise realm, where they want to just correct everything because on paper maybe that posture doesn't look ideal, or maybe because he's not passing some like mobility test. But does it really matter if he can't get into a certain mobility position, which is like mostly static or very slow, when he can hit like amazing angles, like say on the basketball court, and his like internal rotation is just insane as he's like just driving past everybody, or like going up for a dunk and doing a 2-leg jump, and that penultimate step, that leg is like turned in just unbelievably, and he's handling all those braking forces just fine, So it's like, I think there's also a difference between like those tests done at kind of a lower speed versus what happens at a higher speed, because I think like you can teach all the mobility, flexibility, posture, but like does it necessarily transfer to a game situation, chaos, high load, high volume, high velocity?
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction, and I try to tell people that a lot who like are getting into like the nervous system training. Where, well, first thing I kind of tell people, me and Jay kind of have like this like phrase, throwing a baseball is not good for you. Like sports is not good for your body. So when you take a fitness philosophy, which is designed to optimize your health, that could actually take away from your performance, because being good, like creating high velocity, exploding through chaos, like this shit is not what is good for your body to do over and over again. It's very destructive. And so the idea for performance is to optimize so you can last through the destruction and get through it as best as possible, but not to be like balanced or without compensation, or to be like physically healthy to like a fitness standard. And this is where I think there's a lot of confusion. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I do like about the nervous system training a lot is that it kind of exposes the flaws in the athletes that can really help without like overcorrecting things. Because I think like as coaches, there might be a little bit of a tendency to overcorrect. So, which is why I think it's important to like play a certain sport yourself. So you're not like too far away from the action and just getting away from it to the point where you're just like correcting something that is supposed to look a certain way, like in an anatomy book. So I think it's good to like expose and correct some of the minor things that can really help an athlete, especially if they had a history of injuries and stuff, just to shore up those weak points. Because like you said, sports is like certain actions performed over and over and over and over again. It's always high load, high volume, high velocity. So if you're just doing general fitness, you might be better prepared for life in general, but not necessarily for those demands. So I think that's a really important distinction. And it's good to focus on the more specific, like finer tuning.
Yeah.
I kind of have a question for both of you guys. And we're talking about these, we call them like corrective exercise elements in both the nervous system training program and then Ivan, your programs. Ivan, you're doing the Pilates stuff. I'm curious what you think of the ball work and the nervous system training. And then Quintin, you're doing the ball work, the Dr. Elaine's probiotics. I'm curious what you think of Pilates. I don't actually think we've brought up Pilates on this, but I'm curious what role these corrective exercises play in your guys' programs and what you think of the other one.
Okay.
It was actually interesting. I lived in Kyrgyzstan, right next to the beautiful Lake Issyk-Kul. It's like one of the largest saltwater lakes in the world, and it's up in the mountains. It's about like 1,600 meters, so it's about a mile high, so about the same elevation as Denver, Colorado. And that's where all the teams from the former Soviet republics go to hold their training camps, because it's like elevation, not too high, beautiful weather, beautiful landscapes. And I worked there as a Pilates instructor because they would have their own strength and conditioning, so they didn't need that. But I got to work with wrestling teams, Greco-Roman wrestling, freestyle wrestling. I got to work with track and field teams, pentathlon, and fencing, and just a wide variety of sports. And what I noticed when they train Pilates is that, first of all, it's really good to give their bodies a very new stimulus. So, for example, they're used to engaging certain muscles in a certain way. Their nervous system is used to certain exercises. And then you give them a completely new task, which makes their muscles shake, and they have to strain really, really hard to just do a simple leg circle, for example. And if they're used to doing things very fast, sometimes it's good for them to do things really, really slow. Like I could see certain freestyle and Greco-Roman wrestlers that are just absolute beasts. They could handle insane workloads. And they were just kind of looking at the exit, seeing if they could just get out of my session real quick. And maybe when the coach is not looking, they could run off, because it was so challenging for them to be in certain positions, doing certain moves, articulating their spine, moving the spine in a different way. because like the freestyle wrestlers, they're all like hunched over forward, for example, which is a necessary adaptation, but that doesn't mean that you can't introduce some back extension and a kind of a new stimulus for them to get some dormant muscles awakened again. Greco-Roman wrestlers, for example, are more of a neutral posture, but incredibly stiff and things like that. So I like giving them like this new stimulus that just makes their body and their nervous system work in a different way, feel the muscles in a different way. And I feel like they can benefit from it without necessarily becoming like ballerinas. You know, if it's dosed properly, it's also very good for active recovery. They found it very beneficial, and I definitely enjoyed working with them as well.
Yeah, and to kind of carry on what Ivan was talking about. One thing I noticed when you start because there is a similar. I almost feel like when you look at like the ball work methodology Dr. Edith created, and you look at like the traditional Pilates system, like they almost seem like they're kind of like related, like they're cousins in a way. They run on a very similar demand out of the nervous system. And what I think really helps with running athletes through those types of neuromuscular strength exercises, where it emphasizes more neuromuscular strength, and where I think the benefit is, say, like the difference between doing some like Pilates movements that are very challenging for the athletes, or say like a back squat, is that the back squat will really leverage primary muscle strength, but it doesn't always leverage dynamic secondary muscle strength as well. You know, and when you look at sports movement, your secondary muscles actually are active more than the primaries for a majority of these dynamic movements. For slight movements of like the hip abduction and the internal rotation, you know, just a couple inches so your foot can hit properly on the ground to cut corners or something like that. And when you start working these other systems that require more neuromuscular strength, more recruitment of the secondaries with the primaries, hitting more leverage points that maybe your body isn't always hitting because there's a bar on your back. It's another thing to think about with a lot of these strength modalities. Your leg position and your joint angles are usually limited to like 3. You know, feet like this, and you got to hinge up and down, triple extension, legs out, 1 foot forward, 1 foot back, and you do a split. But when you start going into Pilates, you can really start loading the body in weird dynamic joint angles that are going to show up in a sports movement more than, say, in the strength and conditioning movements that the bars or the machines allow you to be in. You know, mostly for safety reasons. So it's like it's just a way to challenge the athlete more dynamically, because everyone thinks like sprint mechanics and vertical jumps, right? That's like the big sexy that everyone's trying to sell. But sports, like there's sprint mechanics in sports 100%. But athletes need to move like laterally. They need to move rotationally. They need to be able to vertical jump while they're spinning. You know, there's so many different elements and soft qualities that most strength and conditioning protocols can't hit. And so when you hit some of these athletes with, say, like your traditional Pilates exercises, all of a sudden their body is challenged in different ranges of motion. Different fascial lines are hit, you know, with strength. Different secondaries are not used to activating. And I think that's probably one of the core elements, you know, why it's so effective, like to hit athletes with this different type of neuromuscular strength. Now, you did mention something about like the correlation behind like corrective exercises, correct, Jake? There was another part of the question I didn't want to leave out.
You cover most of it, but yeah, I was curious the relative role that the corrective exercise play in each of your training.
Yeah, so when you look at things like the NASM, like the National Academy of Sports Medicine, the overhead squat test, the single leg squat test, and you want to look for these different biomechanical weaknesses. Now, there is value in that. You know, you definitely don't want your athlete to land with hard knee valgus, right? I'm sure me and Ivan can both agree, like that's not ideal. But those are kind of like signals of where the athletes are leaking force, leaking power. You know, you got to think rate of force development. So is there some quality in corrective exercises for sports? 100%. I think there's some quality that could be derived from it. But you also gotta respect the fact that a lot of these athletes may have imbalances on purpose that makes them a better athlete. Like, so here's like an analogy you can think about. Like when you look at the F-22 Raptor, it's an American fighter jet, right? It's a very, very advanced jet. Now, the design, the aerodynamics of the F-22 Raptor, like the back wings, the dorsal wings, and they're actually imbalanced on purpose, right? Like the wings are slightly tilted this way, these are slightly out of balance this way. So when it yaws and pitches and rolls, it overdoes it. It like does it to such an extreme level, and it has an internal computer to keep the own airplane, keep the jet from actually killing the pilot. Because the G forces, if you were allowed to maneuver the way it was designed to, you kill the pilot. But that gives it just a couple of edges of speed and maneuverability to outperform like these other like third generation fighter jets. Now imagine instead of a fighter jet, you got like a baseball player, where one oblique might be developed less than the other. The transverse of the right oblique sling going in one direction is way overdeveloped, and the other side isn't that developed. Now, if you try to correct that, they actually might lose exit velo because that imbalance has been like pushed into their body on purpose and is actually responsible for them being great. So there is the quality corrective exercise can have, but you also got to respect, there's the context. Where is this athlete at in their development? How many years are they into this? Like if they're a youth, you can probably play around with it a little bit more to help the longevity side as they grow into their adult frame. If they're a pro, you want to build a system to protect the imbalance as much as possible so the imbalance doesn't run out of control, because they also got to, if the imbalance runs out of control, overcompensation patterns, breakdown of certain joint mechanics will show up. So you do want to have some sort of optimization so they can maintain the imbalance as best as possible without it breaking them down. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think like when they're experiencing pain and it's starting to affect their performance, that's when you want to kind of go in and see what can be corrected without like overhauling the whole system. And it's interesting that you mentioned landing mechanics as well, because yeah, like in training, I would like if I'm having an athlete do a depth drop, I would want them to land well, like without knee valgus, good position, going to the forefoot, and then kind of slowly rolling onto the heel without smacking the heel and all these things. But then I watched some of those NBA highlights and they're like landing on another guy's head, or they're like landing on one leg and then they're like stumbling to like three other guys, you know? So I think a lot of it is just being like neurologically sound in order to be able to brace for that impact quickly and have that nervous system figure out how to land without killing yourself in environments that are less than ideal. So you kind of need a little bit both. You need that perfect technique in training, but you also have to keep in mind that it'll be very chaotic when they do play.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So I've another question for kind of going back into like the Soviet Union history, like the progression of like Russian athletics. So you're saying right now in Russia that things are kind of getting a little bit more westernized with their strength and conditioning protocols. You know, out of popularity, out of where follow the money. Everyone's following where the money's going, right? And the Western side of things in sports is where all the money is at. But I do notice that the performance coaches have held on to these old school Soviet methodologies. Like they never let it go. And they kind of, what I've noticed out of the Eastern coaches, like when you look at the Chechenian coaches, the Dagestani coaches, the Russian wrestling coaches, they kind of hard baked a lot of these Soviet modalities into their skill work. And it's kind of created like this weird hybrid system, you know, and that's kind of where I think things are at right now, where in the East, it's less on the strength and conditioning, and they're very skill work dominant. And they kind of bake in performance modalities within that. And that's where they're getting their success. Do I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely like, especially in combat sports, there's definitely more of a blend of like skill work and strength and conditioning work, especially like in MMA more so, and in boxing. In wrestling, they do have like dedicated lifting days and stuff like that, but they also do a lot of like body weight strength and a lot of those kind of body weight exercises. They would do them like as a warm up, like a wheelbarrow, like someone's holding the other guy's legs and he's in a plank and he has to walk really fast, or he has to jump on his hands and stuff like that. So that's definitely baked in. Maybe in like boxing, it's less of like just a pure strength sport. Um, there's more of that. Maybe a little bit less in wrestling, where they do have like dedicated lifting.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And then, Ivan, I'm kind of going to a cultural question here. What role does combat sports play culturally, just in Russia and Eastern Europe? Like, do people train to, like, are they trying to do it for themselves? Is it like an individual pursuit? Is it for their families to like what's their motivation? How do they handle wins, losses? Do they do it for fun? Do they do it for pride, for legacy? Like, in general, how would you? I mean, obviously everyone's different, but how does that mindset compare to what you've seen with Western fighters and the likes?
Well, I think the combat sports in general are way more popular in the former Soviet Union, whether it's Eastern Europe or Central Asia, or definitely in the Caucasus. I think in general, there's more of like a traditional kind of masculine culture where it's like if you're a man, you're expected to be able to defend yourself and your family potentially. So a lot of people want to just like train their kids. They're like, well, I don't know if I want my kid's brain scrambled from too much boxing, but he's definitely going to learn some self-defense if some bullies try to mess with him, that kind of thing. And then obviously in some regions like Dagestan and Chechnya, they have more of a tradition of that because I guess that they're more of like kind of fighting people in general. Over the years they've had some wars, including with Russia and things like that. So they have more of that kind of a fighter mentality and even more of a traditional masculine culture. And I think with guys like Khabib Nurmagomedov, for example, and his dad, obviously, who did a very good job developing a lot of fighters, it's becoming more and more popular. And now young people have something somebody to look up to, and something to look forward to, and just to kind of occupy their time. So I think in some ways it's also good politically to just try to keep them in these combat sports and not doing crime and not being like recruited as radicals, which is something that can unfortunately happen in some of those regions. And so I think overall, yeah, it's a very big part of the culture. And some people see it as an opportunity to go pro. Other people just see it as kind of a masculine expression.
Interesting. No, Ivan, there's something that I've also thought about when it comes to like American combat sport athletes compared to like Eastern combat sport athletes. And I've never trained with anyone from Dagestan or Chechnya or Russia, but I have been kind of watching them like through UFC press conferences and documentaries, and I've noticed that the Eastern European, like the former Soviet Union area of fighters, they're a lot more quiet. They're a lot less grandiose. They don't really they're a lot more like mannered, uh, and they're just a lot more internal, right? When you say compared to someone like like your stand like a Floyd Mayweather or something like that, where there's like a big show, like there's a lot of trash talking, but then we look at someone like Islam or who's that one? He's like a 145er. He was like a former UFC champion. He lost his belt to Sterling because of an accidental knee. Uh, can't
Peter
remember his
Yan.
name. Yeah, Peter Yan. Very stoic, very quiet, very chill. He's just in there just to kick your ass. That's basically it. Nothing else outside of that. Like, maybe you can give us some insight on what you're seeing and why that kind of culture in fighting shows up so much, but in West it doesn't.
Well, when it comes to areas like Dagestan, for example, they're very big on respect. So they'll be very hospitable. Like you go anywhere in the Caucasus, very friendly, very hospitable. But you have to make sure that you're very respectful towards them, towards their culture, towards their traditions. So you could have a great time, but you have to make sure that you're not purposely or accidentally kind of crossing any boundaries. So when I was watching Conor McGregor talk all that trash to Khabib, and he was showing up like calm and ready to go. I already knew what was going to happen, because they don't really like that kind of style, to where like to Connor, it's like, oh, it's just show business. I'm just going to talk trash, and it's like understood and it's acceptable. In the Caucasus and in like Eastern Europe, there's a little bit less of that. I think you kind of have to answer for your words a little bit more. If you say something disrespectful, and it's not just like treated as just part of show business. But it's interesting that they did try to change that. There was a whole phenomenon. It was called pop MMA, where they would just get guys that are like barely even considered amateurs, and they would just be talking trash to each other. There was this hotshot promoter promoting like bare knuckle fighting, boxing, MMA style fights, and they would just be like talking trash to each other. They would like fight each other on the streets, and they would like try to fight each other. Or they would have like one guy getting jumped by like 10 other guys. And it used to stoke a lot of like racial division as well, where like, oh, look at this guy. Look at this monkey boy trying to fight us like pure bloods or whatever. That's all these jackals can do is just gang up like 10 on 1. And it was like, I would read the comments to some of those pre-fight promos, and it was just disgusting. They eventually closed it down. I think there were a lot of violations, and the government kind of closed them down. He's broke now, trying to make a comeback. But they definitely attempted that kind of a Western style, like almost like a WWE pro wrestling style, and it worked for a while. But it was like they just brought out the absolute worst in people, and I don't think it was very natural to how the real professionals in those regions approach combat sports.
I think I know what you're talking about. Like, Jake, have you ever seen whenever there's like a weird ass MMA show, 3-on-1 MMA show weird crazy fights at a press conference? It's always a Russian promoter. You know what I mean? So it's like you see these crazy like MMA type circus events.
And they would have like a event where they would just sit there and talk. Like there would be like two fighters just sitting there talking trash to each other, and then they could immediately go for like into a ring for like 5 to 10 minutes and just like do a quick fight. They had that kind of segment. Or they would just like start fights at the press conference itself, and a bunch of people jump in, and it was just like it was way over the top. But okay. I don't think it's like very natural. I don't think that aspect of show business is very natural to Russia, even though they're kind of starting to catch up to the West in terms of that, because it sells tickets, it promotes. But I think for a lot of people culturally, they not everybody is built like that. Basically, like for Floyd Mayweather, like it's not that he's trying to play a role. That's just who he is, and like Conor McGregor too. But that's not who a lot of these Eastern European, Caucasus, Central Asian fighters are. They're more like based on respect and kind of traditional values.
Yeah, I guess so. That's what happens. That's what happens when like real AK-47s get shot at people for a long time. You kind of watch your words a little bit. In America, like it's pretty much a bubble over here. You get away with a lot.
Yeah.
Ivan, we've been hammering you with questions this whole time. I wanted to give you an opportunity. If I know you've been following the podcast for a while, I'm wondering if there's anything that you've been wondering, any questions you have, just in your time watching, in your time studying this stuff.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, it's great to have a very different perspective on strength and conditioning. I always kind of lean towards the more like rebellious voices in that. Even going back to something like Pilates, Joseph Pilates was a very big rebel in his time. His method didn't really catch on until after he died. And I think it's always good to kind of drive innovation like that, because as soon as like people are like, oh, this is the way we've always done it, and this is how we're going to go, and we're just going to juggle these 3 or 4 variables. And I'm a good coach because I have more experience juggling these variables as opposed to like getting a whole new paradigm. So I really love seeing that. But I'm just kind of curious where you guys think training is going now. For example, with the nervous system training and the emphasis on fascia, because like to me, I took the anatomy trains courses and stuff like that, read like Robert Schleip, all those like fascia in sports. And for a while, I was fascinated by it, but then I started to think, okay, maybe it's just like an unproven scam. But now I'm starting to see that there's so much unknown and so many different variables there. Can you train the fascia separately? Can you not train it? Maybe you guys can talk to me a little bit about that, or maybe there's like some other direction where you feel this particular method of training is heading in.
Okay. Jake, do you want me to go in on the fascia stuff a little bit?
I'll just real quick before you do, before you go in deep, I'll just say from my perspective, I'm seeing the analytics, and so I can say, like, culturally, I can see this plyometric training is getting more popular. The nervous system training, Marinovich, like all these are keywords that are getting more popular now, and fascia is right there as well. So that's my insight, is just to the video analytics. And I've done episodes with a bunch of trainers on my own podcast, and then we have a lot of videos out on this podcast. So I've seen a lot of the keywords in these areas, and yeah, just from my perspective, I think that culturally people are getting it, but it's also hard to explain pretty consistently. So I think that we're like a couple breakthroughs away in terms of like Western science, until people are able to like wrap their minds around it and integrate it more ubiquitously.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. It is trend. These ideas are trending, because I think, well, okay. So a couple things where I think, let's kind of talk about like this whole fascia idea, because I've been like, like kind of like you. I've been in and off. I've been on and off like the fascia train like a bunch of times. This is what I think is going on, which is really confusing people. First, let's kind of talk about like language. But now, when it comes to like the fascia and how fascia training is marketed, or how ideas of training are marketed in general, you have to use certain language to context your marketing. And that drives a lot of confusion, because there's two sides to the industry. There's the consumer side, and then there's the trainer side, right? Like the trainers come up with methodologies and they have to sell it to the consumers to buy in on it. Just like capitalist structure. It has to work this way. Now, in order for the consumers to understand what you're talking about, you have to language it in a certain context so they know what they're buying into. And that's where you get fascial training. That's where you get like nervous system training. You get CrossFit. You get Pilates. But if you were to strip away the language and just think about it, all of it is just different forms of stimulating the body to enhance certain mechanics, right? That's all training is. And so the language of it is where it really kind of confuses everyone. Now, how I've been thinking about the fascial system, because I've been in and out of it. I thought it was really cool, and then I'm like, maybe this isn't really, or maybe it is kind of like a trend or like a scam or something like that. Like this weird like confusion you're feeling in your head. It's just because of the way we're using the language is what's confusing everyone, even the trainers. So when we talk fascial training, you can't isolate the fascia. You can't isolate the muscle. You can't isolate the skeleton. You can't isolate anything. It's all fused together. It's all a big system of tissue and fluid, and one cannot work without the other. Like, can you imagine if you stripped away like your skeleton? It'd be a disaster. If you stripped away the fascia, it'd be a disaster. They're all codependent. But what you want to do when it comes to quote unquote fascia training is you're doing modalities to hyper accelerate certain mechanics that the fascia governs, right? Recoilability, elasticity, shock absorption, and kinetic energy, displacement, right? These are all mechanics that the fascia is mostly responsible for. Not solely, it's a conjoined system. Like you can't have the stretch shortening cycle with the fascia alone or with the muscle and tendon alone. They both work in tandem. Like you need them both working together. But you can do certain modalities to bring out certain mechanisms out of the fascial system more so than, say, other modalities. Like when you look at a weightlifting modality, say you do like a Zercher squat, right? Is the fascial system working in a Zercher squat? Yes, 100% it is. It's working for whatever you're trying to make it work for. But in a sports setting where you need elastic quality, you need elastic recoil, you need good shock absorption, and you need aerial direction, being able to maneuver your body without a ton of leverage on the ground, say mid-air flight or something like that. Those type of qualities, the fascia helps promote those qualities to improve. Those mechanisms are more governed by the fascial system. So you're training your body to enhance those mechanisms. And so when people say you can't isolate fascia, everything is training the fascia. Yes, everything is training the fascia. Everything is training the skeleton too. It's all linked together. But can you do modalities to enhance certain qualities out of the body that are more governed towards fascia, that are more governed towards neuromuscular control, that are more governed towards tendon elasticity? And so that's how I'm trying to, I guess, rebrand it so people can kind of understand. And I really didn't start thinking about this until I started talking to Dr. Edith Hoyce, who wrote Probot X. Ivan, are you familiar with Probot X? Have you read that book or looked into it? Yeah.
I know a little bit about it. Yeah, I've seen the website. I know it's related to the Marinovich system in general, but not like intimately familiar, if you will.
Yeah, so Marv Marinovich was big into Soviet training methodology, and he was trying to, he worked with this guy named Dunkmaster to come up with the isokinetic accelerators and the supercats, and it was all how do you enhance stretch shortening cycle activation. But he was starting to plateau, and Todd Marinovich was talking about this. He said, "Hey, I was getting, good." I was throwing the ball further, but as far as my 40-yard dash really didn't improve that much. My broad jump didn't really improve that much. And I was doing all this athletic training. I wasn't necessarily becoming a better athlete. I was just becoming a better quarterback, right? And that's what Todd Marinovich was talking about. He said things didn't really train until Marv started doing what he called the good stuff, the good form of the training. That's when Marv started working with Dr. Edith Hoyce. And Dr. Edith came up with this whole concept of fascial hydration and elastic development with the ball work and balance training. That was kind of like her sort of creation. She took a lot of the ideas from Pilates and yoga and added more strength and stability elements to them, following certain biomechanical, what I call global movements. Where this is more like an isolated movement, and this is more like a global movement where it uses more different points of leverage out of a single limb. And so with that, she found a way to start training the elastic quality, the movement quality, enhancing the soft quality in an athlete, the foot strength. Now, she didn't even know it was fascial at the time. We didn't really understand fascial systems until around 2007 is when we really started realizing, oh shit, this is responsible for a lot of different things when it comes to movement. And she was the one that told me, listen, this isn't necessarily a muscle and tendon system thing that you're doing. It's a fascial system thing that you're doing. Those are the mechanics we're actually enhancing. And then when you pair that up with the plyometrics, it has a crazy synergistic effect on performance. So that's how I'm kind of looking at things now. When you kind of understand the fascial system needs low load, rhythmic kinetic forces, like jumping, that's rhythmic kinetic forces, with a low load at a tempo that doesn't hit failure. Those are the principles to enhance qualities that assist you in sports. Maybe it doesn't assist you in hiking. Maybe it doesn't assist you in Ninja Warrior, or rock climbing or something like that. But in velocity movements, running, throwing, jumping, sprinting, we can enhance the qualities to assist with that. So it's not that the training is fascia based. We're enhancing mechanics of the fascia to support the athletic goal. Does that make sense how I kind of broke it down?
Yeah, absolutely. So you could look at it as having a dial to where each training can be more muscular based, a little bit more fascia based. In those video games, in Madden, you could have 90% pass, 10% run, or the other way around, a slider scale.
Exactly. Yeah. You're raising certain stats, but there is kind of a universal thing where the more you can enhance these certain qualities out of the fascia to support velocity, velocity improves, injury resistance improves. When you lean the dial more towards that side, you start noticing that all of a sudden they're not just becoming, they're not just getting better at their sport, they're also getting better at overall athletics. This is where I think talent lies. These qualities, these mechanisms that the fascia governs more so than just the muscular system. And the more I research it, the more, and it's hard to understand. This is the part that's also really confusing, is that this system kind of breaks the laws of physics as we know it. Like you have, like me and Jake, we were kind of going into like non-Newtonian solid, right? We were like looking at that where you can take like water and cornstarch in a couple mixtures, right? You mix it together, and you can run your hands through it like a liquid, like mud. But then when you hit it really hard, it solidifies and it absorbs the shock. So it's like it's a solid and a liquid at the same time, depending on the velocity, which is really weird for our brains to understand, right? We're, gas, solid, liquid. We like it 1, 2, 3. We're more like bilateral in our thinking. But the fascia is like multi-dimensional, where it can stretch and become hard and then relax, and then under force it can break. It can do all these weird dynamics, and it can stretch. Like here's a weird thing where it's like a web, and when they stretch it apart, it like strays apart from each other, kind of like strands of silk. But then when it comes back together, it reclumps into a liquid again, into like its original mass. Like it's really fucking weird, and it's like trying to learn about outer space, where you can tell this is a little bit too much for your brain. Like it's like you can hit the edge of what you can understand, like with your brain. That's kind of like where the fascial system is. That's why I think there's so much controversy and confusion around it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Ivan, I'm curious, Ivan, just from your context, like what do people think about fascia and fascial driven training and all that in Russia? Is it a newer thing, an older thing? Are people taking to it, or do you see people kind of thinking it's not real training?
Yeah, so in Russia, the anatomy trains is very popular, and there's a whole phenomenon called smart fitness. So, like, obviously, it's obviously marketing. So, like, all you guys are dumb meatheads, but we're over here doing smart fitness, and so they're really big into fascia, and they're like almost like like fascia cures cancer. All you got to do is just fix this little fascial line over here, and they'll help you lose weight. They'll help you do this. They'll help you do that. They'll just cure all of your problems. It will solve all the world wars if everybody just did fascia training. And a lot of the things that they do, it like works for people who kind of just need to get moving. So there's like an upside to that. Like if someone doesn't do any exercise, and they have all those like preconceived notions, like, oh, if I lift weights, it will be too dangerous for me. Running might be dangerous. Like they're like scared of just doing any exercise. They can jump into this smart fitness, and they'll like teach them how to open up their diaphragm for 30 minutes. And then they will have them do like some kind of foot to glute activation where they like rotate into a glute, and it like barely does anything stimulus wise. It kind of maybe works certain fascial lines, but for them it's a huge stimulus because they haven't done anything. And so it's kind of like associated, like fascia is starting to become associated with like those smart fitness gurus. Obviously, like people who do like legit training don't really like them that much. So that's kind of where it is in Russia at the moment. But I think like in the context of performance, not a lot of people are really exploring it like that, because some of the Pilates schools that teach fascia, some of those smart fitness schools, they're more focused on just like getting money from other coaches so they can like certify them, and they can open up their own schools, and then these coaches can promote their system and bring in more people, and stuff like that. But in the sense of sports performance, I don't really hear a lot of like what Quintin's talking about in the Russian area of training, for example.
Yeah, it always.
Maybe we'll start using hashtag smart fitness.
Yeah, that smart fit.
Yeah,
that's kind of the interesting thing, where that's kind of exactly what I'm talking about, where how they have to like context it with a language to try to resell it, and I think that just leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, and it kind of discredits the science of it, which is unfortunate, because there is a bit of a separation, and this kind of does relate to what we were talking about with the Soviet Union, where with this new capitalist, let's say capitalist Western model of training, where it prioritizes on sales and coaching, and science is like the last thing that kind of like hits like the model, and in the Soviet Union, everyone was a scientist first. Like the scientists and the coaches worked side by side, and they're open to experimentation and they're open to debates, and because they didn't have to sell it, like you said, they would get the government would pay them. They can be in a room with a bunch of other minds and a bunch of other athletes, and they just go to work. They just start labbing. Now when you don't have those kind of financial benefits, you're forced to like come up with new ideas and how do I put a spin on this and how can I package this together and convince someone that this is new and interesting, because people need to be sold. People need to like feel good about this product, think that this is going to help them. Even if it does help them, they need to emotionally be attached to it before they'll give you the money. And that comes with good and bad, because there's a lot of products that sell. There's a lot of training that sells that's freaking awesome. There's also a lot of training that sells that's kind of mediocre, or it's kind of overhyped, and so it really creates confusion, and it ruins the science culture that's in sports coaching right now. And I told this with Jake, like we're supposed to be scientists first, and we coach our athletes through our science. And in these Western models, it's the opposite, where we're coaches first, and we coach these athletes through our method, and we kind of reference science last, just to make sure that we're hitting the textbook criteria. And I think that's really where things are at kind of right now. Things went the opposite. They're inversed, how they used to be in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, Vivek Koshansky didn't have to worry about what lead magnet he's going to run today,
Yeah. Tell me about it. Yeah, man, it's a little unfortunate, but that's just the nature of things. And let me ask you this, Ivan, because we're almost out of time. Where do you see? Because right now you're working all these systems, and you can kind of see how Marv Minovich was influenced to a lot of the Soviet methodology. Because he was big into like customizing programs for one individual, not broad training programs like the Western model. Now, given where we're at with this capitalist structure, how things have to be sold, how training usually has to be generalized with the current model, do you ever see it going backwards, or are we kind of stuck on this path?
Well, I think maybe with the advancements in AI, there could be a lot of help in kind of making the programs more customized for people. Like, who knows where that will go? But I think that could be a big kind of a breakthrough that I'm sure a lot of scientists wish they had back in the day as well. But also, I think that there are not many systems like that. But I think in some ways there can be a system that is so well designed and so sound that if it doesn't work for the athlete, it's now a problem with the athlete. So I think that there can be space for like my system or the highway, if it's very well thought out, and if you can maybe customize it just a little bit, maybe to like the certain level of preparation. And to me, like the only systems that come close right now are the Marinovich system and then the Jay Schroeder system of training, because they're working from the nervous system out. They have a very basic core philosophy that's similar, but some divergences later. But I think at some point there might be a system that is like that's just going to fit everybody.
Yeah. All right. Interesting stuff. Jake, do you have anything to add? Any other questions?
No, I think it's cool to hear kind of what we've been talking about, contextualize a little better. But yeah, it's been interesting. Thanks for coming on, Ivan.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, thank you, man. This is really insightful stuff. It's good to hear like all these different perspectives on sports and training from all over the world, and maybe this is how it's done, Ivan. Maybe this is like communication like this, talking about it, and people can start connecting the dots. Maybe the only way it changes is the athletes kind of go through the paradigm where, they're going to subscribe to private customization over generalized training. Maybe that's where it's going to happen. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, thank you both of you guys for what you're doing to that end. I know a lot of people out there watching appreciate it. And speaking of which, thanks everyone who's been following along. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Send your messages to Nervous System Training Podcast at Gmail or Nervous System Training Podcast on Instagram. We'll get your videos, get your messages in the queue, add them to the subject for the next episodes. Thank you much.
Hey guys.